The latest comments from the Reserve Bank Governor about the economy, the unemployment rate, the need to get more growth into the economy, possibly cut interest rates even further. They must show that you're concerned about the sluggishness of the national economy.
Well, the Governor of the Reserve Bank, Chris, has pointed out that the labour market is strong, that the fundamentals of the Australian economy are strong. But what we've seen throughout the world is relatively low interest rates, low inflation, and at the same time relatively low unemployment. This is a new paradigm for central banks all around the world to navigate. We've just released the final budget outcome for 2018-19, and it showed that the budget is in balance for the first time in 11 years. This is a very significant achievement off the back of more people in a job. Indeed, we've seen more than 300,000 jobs created over the last year, and what that means is higher receipts and lower payments, and that is a sign of an economy which continues to grow. So while Germany, Sweden, Singapore, the UK and others had negative growth in the June quarter, the Australian economy continues to grow. But we certainly are not complacent, Chris, with those global trade tensions and the punishing drought here at home.
Well, indeed, you've got the budget back into balance, but you need to deliver on those surpluses if you're going to pay down some of the debt that's been gathered, and if you're going to try and get unemployment even lower as well, and wages growth. Clearly you need to increase economic growth, and clearly the Reserve Bank Governor is concerned about it if he's looking at cutting interest rates yet again next Tuesday.
Well, we are spending a record amount on infrastructure. We have a 10-year, $100 billion pipeline, and, you know, for half a century, big projects like an airport rail link in Melbourne, or a second airport for Sydney, or the Snowy 2.0 project. For half a century, those projects were left on the drawing board. We're now getting on with them, as well as, you know, busting congestion in our cities and unlocking the potential of our region. So we've got a busy and full infrastructure pipeline. We've just passed the most significant tax cuts in more than 2 decades. We're abolishing a whole tax bracket, Chris, and Australians who earn between $45,000 and $200,000 will pay a marginal rate of no more than 30 cents in the dollar, and already $17 billion has made its way out of the ATO to the pockets of hardworking Australians. So there is measures that are in place that will drive continued economic activity, and of course those that 50 basis point rate cuts from the Reserve Bank has helped stabilise the housing market too.
The Reserve Bank Governor previously, about a month ago, has suggested even that public sector wage increases could be one way to stimulate the economy. Anastasia Palaszczuk in Queensland has done that. She's handed out $250 million in bonuses to Queensland public servants. Are you pleased that that might actually kick the economy along in Queensland, or are you worried that those public sector pay increases effectively could flow on to public servants on the federal payroll, for instance?
Well, at the federal level, what we've said in relation to public service wages is that they are growing above inflation. And if you look at the average wage for a public servant, it's around $95,000 compared to around $85,000 across the private sector. So there already are higher wages in the public sector as public servants than in the private sector. As for Queensland, this is a question for the Queensland government that it must explain to the people of Queensland, and it will be accountable to them in the polls due next year. So,
but is there any economic justification for what Anastasia Palaszczuk has done? I mean, is it good for the Queensland economy, or is this just an electoral bribe, for want of a more subtle term?
Well, we're putting our money towards infrastructure projects. We're handing back the money of hardworking Australians through tax cuts and, of course, spending on education and health and a whole series of other measures. We've decided to go down that route rather than subsidising higher wages.
What's your view, though, of what the Queensland Premier has done with these cash bonuses for public servants?
Well, I'd rather see money go into infrastructure projects, to be honest, but ultimately they run their own budget and they're accountable to their own community in Queensland. As for the federal government, we've made our decision, which is what our priorities are, and already we've seen public service wages be above inflation, considerably above inflation, but also to see them around $10,000 higher than what you see in the private sector.
You mentioned, of course, that the drought has an impact on the national economy. I suppose that can hardly be understated at the moment. So rain would not only just bring relief to communities, eventually would flow down into some increased economic growth. But is there a case for, excuse me, is there a case for more financial assistance now to people affected by the drought?
Well, the drought's been devastating, not just to the economy, but obviously to those local communities involved. We've seen the farm GDP output down 8.3% through the year, and that is a direct flow-on effect from the drought and from the floods. And we also know that it impacts upon the manufacturing sector, because so much of the manufacturing sector is also involving food manufacturing. So it's about 1/4 percentage point straight off GDP growth. That's the economic story. There's also, as I said, the real impact that it's having on the lives of those who are directly affected. And we are providing not just income support through the household farm allowance, but we've also got a drought community program which is helping to back local government, as well as a $5 billion drought fund, which will see significant money make its way to build the resilience of those local communities in tackling drought. So we have a set of measures already in place. I'll be visiting those local communities next week with David Littleproud and speaking to those people who are affected and working out how the government can continue to support them.
So you'll be going to drought-affected areas. Can you tell us where, and will you have an ear open to see whether there is anything more that should be done with the federal government finances?
We'll be going to New South Wales and to Queensland, and I'll be speaking to them with very much an open mind. And obviously the Prime Minister is very focused on these communities, and so too Deputy Prime Minister McCormack and David Littleproud and Bridget McKenzie and all my colleagues. We really feel for these communities. They do amazing work on the land. They're the heart and soul of Australia, our farming communities, and we need to support them through these very difficult times. And even when the drought breaks and the rains hit, it's going to take some time for these communities to get back on their feet, because, as you know, there's been a lot of destocking, and not only do you have to bring back the lambs and obviously plant the new crops, but that's going to take some time. After what has been a really punishing and devastating drought.
It's pretty clear the country needs more water storage. Dams need to be built. There's been so much talk about this for so long. Can you guarantee that the federal government, in cahoots with state governments presumably, will get work underway before the end of this term of government on new dam infrastructure?
Well, obviously water infrastructure is critical, and you'll remember back when John Howard was the Prime Minister, he had the $10 billion water plan, and unfortunately what we've seen is some battles between states in terms of the Murray-Darling, and what we want to do is ensure that the communities who need the water get it and that they have the right support for the infrastructure. So we are working on a number of measures in that regard.
You've got to build dams, don't you?
Well, dams is definitely part of the equation, absolutely.
Now, just briefly, Treasurer, you mentioned earlier the trade war and that impact on the global economy. China versus the US, ongoing, of course. Everybody has a stake, including those two countries, in ending this as soon as possible. But does China deserve its current status as a developing economy?
Well, as Scott Morrison was pointing out, China has matured as an economy, and we really welcome that. Australia's been a great beneficiary of China's economic growth. Indeed, hundreds of millions of people have been moved out of poverty into the middle classes. This is a wonderful and positive story. At the same time, China's trade agreements, China's environmental obligations need to reflect that new economic status that the country has. It's not a new comment. This has been Australia's position for some time.
Well, the Labor Party is suggesting that they should maintain that developing economy status. It seems bizarre, given, of course, the levels of Chinese foreign investment in this country and also the level of growth in Chinese defence expenditure, that they should be given any special treatment in the world trading system.
Well, we won't take any lectures from the Labor Party on China. Remember, they sat on the fence when it came to a free trade agreement with China, even though that has seen a more than 40% increase in the two-way trade between our two countries since we made that agreement with China back in 2015. We as a country and as a government have placed a great emphasis on improving access for Australian businesses to nearly 2 billion new consumers in our region. The deals that were struck with China, Japan, Korea, the 11-nation Trans-Pacific Partnership, and of course the most recent agreement with Indonesia. The Labor Party always diddle-daddled on these issues. They never actually put their foot to the floor and secured these agreements like we have, and as a result, Australian businesses are now selling to more consumers in our region, and Australia is becoming a more prosperous country as a result.
Now, Josh Frydenberg, you're a Carlton supporter, so like me, an Adelaide fan, the finals, you're a sort of interested bystander. Are you going to back the local Melbourne team, the Richmond Tigers, on Saturday, or are you going to be rooting for the GWS Giants?
Well, look, I welcome the GWS to Grand Final Day. I think that's a great development for the AFL, and it truly is a national competition. But, yes, I think I'll instinctivly be backing the Victorian club there.
Come on. You're just after Richmond votes in your electorate. Back the underdog.
But as you know, Richmond and Carlton are arch rivals, having fought a few grand finals in recent years, and the first game of the season always is Richmond-Carlton. And while I've been fond of saying that Carlton is 15 years into its 5-year redevelopment plan, Chris, I do feel that we may have turned the corner now, and our coach is settled. Cripsy did pretty well in the Brownlow. We've got some really good talent coming through.
Oh, enough about Carlton.
Carlton supporters have a lot more to look forward to than your mob.
On that note, thanks for joining us, Josh Frydenberg.